Okay, so my name is Darren Gertis. I'm a professor. I've been tracking what's going on in Ukraine since essentially since the beginning of the war. I've written a book about Zelensky, and I am doing daily updates to the book and providing daily updates here on video as well. So you came to this video for one of two reasons. Either you're interested in the number of casualties that the Russians have had since the beginning of the war, which is kind of the headline today, or you're interested in a daily update. I'm going to talk about both, but I'm going to weave that through. And then at the very end, I'm also going to update and explain why the casualty rate is what it is. So let's go and look at the headlines, because that's how I process this day by day. I look at the various headlines. Al Jazeera does a great job collating bizarrely, who would have thought? And so here, the big headline is, look, missile strikes in Odessa, missile strikes in Mykolaiv, missile strikes again in the northeast region, town of Chuniv. Okay, I'm not going to belabor what was in Al Jazeera, but missile strikes are all over the country. This is the Guardian. Ukraine, day 144. What we know, the Ukrainian armed forces are advancing confidently toward Kherson. That's a district in the south, according to Ukrainian military spokesperson. Speaking about what's happening directly in the Kherson direction, we are advancing there. Maybe we're not moving as fast as those who present positive news would like, but believe me, steps are very confident. At the same time, the Russians are saying undoubtedly preparations for the next stage of offensive actions are underway. So both the Ukrainians and the Russians are saying, yes, we're ready, we're about to have our fight, and it's about to get hot very quick. I don't just mean missile strikes, I mean kinetic war with infantry and infantry. Okay, next let's look at what's going on in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian military rebuffed Russian advances in Donetsk over the weekend. Bloody battle for the control of the region. What are we talking about? This is the eastern area. The Ukrainians just lost Severodonetsk and Lysychansk over the last 3 and then 2 weeks ago, and they keep trying to push west. Here's Cervesk. This is probably the next city that's going to be in the greatest danger. Down here, we'd see like Bakhmut and other area. Bakhmut is here and other areas around that. If we look at missile strikes, you can see missile strikes on the map. Okay, so what we're going to do is Cervesk is probably the next thing, but there's also outside Slovans. This road here is a bridge between the area that Russians really want to hold and what the Ukrainians really want to hold, and they are holding here. You can see this like shaded area. They're holding in the shaded area, keeping the Russian forces from advancing, but it's just a matter of time to see which side pushes which way. Okay, so that's what's going in the nets. Russian forces were firmly repulsed and suffered losses and withdrew, but that's according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. I'm sure the Russians would tell a different story. Okay, the Russian army resists, or the Ukrainian army resists Russian advances. The Kremlin says that the goal of what it calls the special military operation is to take control of both Luhansk and Donetsk. Now, Luhansk is pretty much completely taken. There's some fighting in Luhansk, but it's very few and far between. On the other hand, about 45% of Donetsk, a region that's also either industrial or farmland, is still held by the Ukrainians. And again, this is that area that we're talking about. This is what is going to be contested next to this region. Okay, let me zoom out just so you can get a sense of what's going on here. Okay, if you see, okay, this border, they want to run up to this border. So only about half of that has been taken so far. Okay, for their part, the Russian armed forces claim high precision attacks that resulted in the elimination of the 115th Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces. The area around Seversk, which we just talked about, has been heavily contested in the last 2 weeks, but is holding out. On the same time, Russia is struggling. The Western officials say that Ukraine absolutely believes it will regain territory and win the war. They're absolutely clear that they plan to restore the whole territory. And now whole territory means Crimea as well, and you'll see how that plays in just a moment. Okay, and they see that Russia's struggling. Russia, that we assess, has lost more than 30% of its land combat effectiveness. Since they began, they lost about a third of their combat effectiveness. This is according to the Defense Staff Admiral Tony Radakin. Okay, now what that means is 50,000 Russian soldiers have either been killed or wounded in the conflict. 50,000. So that's a number you're going to see a couple of times as we talk through this, and then I'll describe how many of those are killed and how many are wounded and that kind of thing when we get to the end. Okay, so that's it for this particular article. Let's go and look at Radio Free Europe has a similar kind of take on what's going on. Russia. So now again, you need to look at various sources. So we looked at Al Jazeera, we looked at The Guardian, we looked at CNN, we're looking at Radio Free Europe. Russian troops have begun to reinforce their position in key cities. Given the pressures on Russian manpower, the reinforcement of the south while the fighting for the Donbas continues indicates the seriousness of which the Russian commanders view the threat. Now, again, if you lost a third of your force, you're going to have these pressures on your manpower, which is why the Russians are now heavily recruiting across the country in the various districts for the military. Britain's top military commander says 50,000 killed or wounded. We just talked about that. It is not only missile strikes from the air and sea, although there have been lots of missile strikes in the last few days, says Vladimir Kiblinski, spokesman for the Ukrainian military intelligence. We can see shelling along the entire line of contact, along the entire front line. There's an active use of tactical aviation and attack helicopters. Now that's an interesting line that factored into the way that I'm seeing this. And when you see these little dots on the map, those are shells or missiles or some kind of artillery strikes. So that's pretty significant. Okay, and then the last thing I want to look at here is this was yesterday, not today. The Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu gave, quote, instructions to further intensify the actions of units in all operational areas in order to exclude the possibility of the Kyiv regime launching massive rocket and artillery strikes on civilian infrastructure and residents in the settlements in the Donbas and other regions. So he's just protecting the civilians in Donbas. That's the way he's trying to explain that, and that goes with the Russian line. When you read RT, when you read Pravda, you see that that's how they explain things. Okay, um, there's a Newsweek article here. Putin unable to match people and equipment, says the defense chief. Same kind of thing. I'm just triangulating. They suffer from low morale. The Russians suffer from low morale compared to the Ukrainians who are defending their homeland, and that makes sense. If you're defending your own house as opposed to somebody who's just trying to come take your stuff, you have a different perspective. Overall, the force is struggling. They're struggling in terms of numbers, but especially struggling in terms of morale, and Putin's unable to match people to the machines that he has. Russia has now returned to forced mobilization in the areas in the Donetsk region, and there's low soldiers morale. Now, this forced mobilization I didn't talk about yet. Now, he's recruiting in Russia in various districts, but in Donetsk and Luhansk, where there's occupied Russian forces, there's forced conscription, and that's to make up some of the numbers as well. Okay, another Radio Free Europe article. Russia has lost 50,000 soldiers in Ukraine, essentially saying the same thing as what was said in the previous. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit for a reason, and then we'll come back to this question about how many casualties. So another big piece of news today was that Zelensky has actually sacked two very prominent officials within his administration. He says he visited the front lines. As a result of this, as you already know, personnel decisions were made regarding the regional heads of the security sector. And then he talks about how, in particular, more than 60 employees of the prosecutor's office and the security service of Ukraine remain in the occupied territory and are working against our state. So they're working with the Russians in these occupied territories. Today, I made a decision to remove the prosecutor general from the office and dismiss the head of the security service. Okay, so now if we're hearing Zelensky's words, this is the primary source data when he says it. Let's go and read about it from like newspapers. Like what other light can they shed on this? Zelensky fired the head of the Ukraine's powerful domestic security agency, the SBU, and the state prosecutor general. The abrupt sackings of the SBU chief, a childhood friend of Zelensky. Like, how about that? Like, that's adding something to it. And the prosecutor general, who played the key role in the prosecution of war crimes, were announced. And because they come to light that many members of their agencies had collaborated with Russia. So you got to do something about that if you're President Zelensky. In other news, now there is some language that Ukrainians were using about, yeah, and and we're going to come and take Crimea. So that is flipping the Russians out. Now here is RT. What I showed so far was the Guardian and US News kind of outlets. Here's RT, Russian television. Ukraine threatened with a crushing blow. Well, why? If they touch Crimea, which is Russian territory, which it wasn't Russian territory before 2014, and it was Russian territory in 1956 when Khrushchev gave it away. And it wasn't Russian territory at other times in history, but they see it as sovereign, sacred Russian territory. Okay, so Mikhail Sheremet, a Russian parliamentarian, was commenting on the continued suggestions by Ukrainian officials that Kyiv forces may hit targets on the Crimean Peninsula or Crimean Bridge. And he stressed that it would be followed if they hit Crimea or the bridge connecting Crimea to Russia. It would be followed by a crushing blow to decision-making centers in Kyiv, military infrastructure, and arms supply logistics channels. The Kyiv regime will receive such a rebuff that it will no longer be able to recover. Well, I mean, if that's the case, why don't you do that now? The warnings followed after Saturday's statement by the military intelligence spokesman, who claimed that Crimea could be targeted by U.S. supplied HIMARS. So with that, former Russian president also warns of Judgment Day. Speaking with the Second World War veterans, he talked about some exalted bloody clowns that are periodically popping up all over with these statements and are trying to threaten us. I mean, attack Crimea and so on. In case of something like that happens, a day of judgment will come to all of them that is simultaneously swift and a hard one. It will be very difficult to hide. And he goes on. Another senator says, threats from Ukrainian junta to attack Crimea or the Crimean Bridge only confirm that denazification and demilitarization must be carried out through the whole of Ukraine. Okay, and so why, they're talking about Crimea. And Crimea, they talk about it as if, okay, in 2014, it by vote returned to Russia. Well, it was a 97% vote for integration in the region. Now, if you live in Russia that you or some a dictatorship somewhere, you might think, wow, they overwhelmingly want to return. If you live in America, you realize that no president in US history has had more than 60% of the vote, other than George Washington, who had unanimous support. But no president has had more than 60% of the popular vote, except for LBJ and Richard Nixon. Now, when you understand that, you look at a 97% vote and you think, that wasn't a real vote. And that's probably what was going on. It was probably 83% turnout. And you know that we never even have anything near 83% turnout. So it was returned to Russia under fake pretenses. Okay, now here's what I promised I would talk about. Here's the casualty rate. And it comes from a number of sources. How many civilians were killed, and the UN confirms this, but we know that it's a lot more. It's probably north of the 12,000 and probably closer to the 20 some odd mark. Ukrainian forces, 23,000 killed according to the Russian government, and according to the US estimate, it's somewhere between 5 and 11,000 killed and 18,000 wounded, and it might be even higher than that. The Ukrainian government says 10,000 killed, 30,000 wounded, and so this is about Ukrainian forces and their figures. Now, for the Russian estimate, the U.S. government claimed 16,000 killed, and that was a month ago. So times have changed. So it has to go north. My guess is about 20,000 actually killed. The UK estimate, and we're just talking about killed. We're not talking about killed and wounded, because killed is going to be one thing, and then wounded is about time and a half of that. So if this is right, let's say the UK estimate is 20,000 killed, and this is a more recent estimate than the US, then another 30,000 would be wounded, and that estimate from Sir Radcliffe, or whatever his name was, and the British would be about right, 50,000 casualties. And in now the way that the Ukrainians do this, when they give their casualty rates, they say 36,000 losses. They're not just counting Russians, they're counting Russians, and they're counting contractors, and they're counting those in the Donetsk and Luhansk Republic. Like, these are laughable. 500 to 600 in Luhansk. Luhansk was a meat grinder over about 3 weeks, and so there's no way that it's only that low. But they're counting all of that. Anybody who's fighting against Ukraine is probably getting counted in this 36, and that might be accurate. I don't know. I know it's probably about 20,000 plus, but I don't know what that is. So this should give you a good estimate of what's going on in Ukraine. I hope that helps you understand what's going on today on July 17th. in the Ukraine-Russian war.